Hey everybody, today we're going to be talking about unemployment. And the goal is to be able to explain how unemployment is measured, as well as something known as the labor force participation rate, to be able to calculate both the labor force participation rate and the unemployment rate, and to describe the relationship between unemployment and economic growth and GDP, as well as to describe the different types of unemployment that people can experience. We start by talking about something known as the labor force, because the labor force is the universe from which we will calculate both the unemployment rate and the labor force participation rate. So who's in the labor force? The labor force is basically anyone over the age of 16 who is a civilian and who is either employed, either full or part-time, or who is considered unemployed. And to be considered unemployed, you have to have not worked in the last week, but you have to have actually sought out work. You have to actually want to be employed and be actively looking to get a job. If you do not meet any of these qualifications, then you are considered out of the labor force and therefore not part of the calculations. Now, why would you not want to be in the labor force? Well, there's lots of reasons why you might not want to be in the labor force. One reason, you might just voluntarily choose to leave the labor force. You could leave the labor force for a variety of reasons. You could have worked for the last 50 years and you want to retire and you're just sort of done with the workplace. Great. But because you're not looking for work, you're no longer part of the labor force. Or maybe you've had a child and you want to stay home and take care of that child while they grow up. You're not working for pay. You're working for sure, but it's not employment per se, and so you're out of the labor force. Or maybe you choose to go back to school. You want to get a master's degree and you're no longer working. You're just focusing on your studies. These are all reasons why you might choose to leave the labor force. Other reasons might be that you're discouraged. A discouraged worker is one that is unemployed. They're looking for work. They've looked for work for so long that they have finally given up. They've said, I'm just never going to get a job. And so I no longer care. I'm not doing it anymore. And so they're leaving the labor force. Or you could have what are called marginally attached workers. And these guys are similar to discouraged workers in that they're no longer looking for work, but it's sort of a short time thing. They're waiting until things get a little better, and then they're going to try again. So while they're out of the labor force, they're not permanently out of the labor force, like many discouraged workers. Now, the labor force participation rate is going to take a look at the overall universe of people 16 or older and see what percentage of that universe of 16 or older is actually participating in the labor market, either with a job, employed, or looking for a job, unemployed. And so what we're looking at here is saying in this example that of the universe of people 16 years or older, 61% of those people have a job. 2% of those people don't have a job and are looking to get one. And fully 37% of the population is no longer interested in trying to find work at all. And so in this case, the labor force participation rate is about 63%. Now, how do we calculate the number? Well, if we have data, we would take the overall labor force, that's employed plus unemployed, and then divide it by the overall population, 16 or older, and multiply by 100 to get a percentage. If we're using data, you can have a table like this, and this is constructed to look sort of like the Census Bureau's data, Bureau of Labor Statistics. And we could say, okay, we have a citizen population, civilian population, 16 or older, of 250,000 people. Within that 250,000 people, we have 125,000 people who are employed, 25,000 people who are unemployed. And then the rest are either discouraged or marginally attached or have voluntarily left. So if we're looking for labor force participation, we'll take the civilian labor force, the employed plus unemployed, add them together. We get 150,000 people who are actively participating, and divide it by the overall population, which is 250,000. So in this case, we would see that about 60% of all of those people who are potentially participating in the labor force are actually choosing to do so. The unemployment rate is looking at the labor force and saying what percentage of the overall labor force has a job and what percentage of the overall labor force is looking for a job. So in this case, based on the data that went to calculating this chart, 96% of the labor force has a job, 4% of the labor force is unemployed. Again, we're taking the number of people who don't have a job but want one and are looking for one and dividing that number by the overall labor force, those with a job and those looking. Again, looking at the data, we would say in this case, the labor force is 150,000 people. There's 125,000 people with a job, 25,000 people without one, but are looking to get one. And we're saying, okay, out of that 150,000 person labor force, what percentage doesn't have a job? So we do 25,000 divided by 150,000, multiply by 100. We'd see that the unemployment rate in this example is 16.67%, which is awfully high. Now, that unemployment rate can be somewhat deceiving at times because we're not including discouraged workers, which are people who would like to work, would love to get a job, but they've given up trying to find one. If we were to add in the discouraged workers, we'd find that the unemployment rate is actually slightly higher than the official number. It is also true as you analyze data in the real world, as you watch the news and you see unemployment rates reported, that you don't always think it's a bad thing to have an unemployment rate rise, and it's not always a good thing when the unemployment rate drops. It sort of depends in part on the labor force participation rate. So there are times in which the unemployment rate is going to jump or going to rise because people who were discouraged are no longer discouraged. They look out into the future and they see a bright economic opportunity and they choose to try once again to try and find a job. And when they re-enter into the labor force, they may not get hired right away, but as they re-enter, they're now considered unemployed. And because of that, you will see the unemployment rate go up. But it's good because these guys think they're going to find a job, may very well find a job. And so in the short term, the unemployment rate rose, but in the long term, we expect it to go down. So that's a good thing. Similarly, if people decide that the economy looks like it's going bad, they can leave the labor force. They can give up. And even though the number of people employed remains the same, they've left, and that causes the unemployment rate to drop. Not necessarily a good thing. It's not it's not that the economy's better. It's just that people have decided not to work anymore. And there are lots of reasons why. In fact, we saw this a little bit after COVID in 2020, 2021, 2022. The unemployment rate was dropping really quickly. And in some cases, it's because people were getting rehired back, which was great. But in another portion of that number dropping is because people did not return to the labor force. The labor force participation rate actually shrank. So there were fewer people working, which is not necessarily a good thing. So the unemployment rate may have dropped, but it doesn't necessarily mean that things are always rosy. What we do know, though, is that there is a correlation typically with unemployment and GDP. And that correlation is somewhat self-obvious. When GDP shrinks, unemployment tends to rise. So if you look at the graph and you can see these sort of colored bars, these are where we had periods of recession when the GDP shrank. And every time GDP shrinks, unemployment rates tend to spike. And then as the economy begins to recover and GDP begins to grow again, we see that unemployment rates tend to fall. Now, one last note on employment, and that is this. Just because you have a job doesn't mean you're happy. There are lots of people who are considered underemployed. That is, workers who are only part-time. They would like to work more. They would desperately enjoy a full-time job, but they don't have one. Now, they're considered employed, so as far as the unemployment rate goes, they're a positive. They're employed, but they want more, and they can't get it. So that's also something to sort of consider is as you're looking at data and analyzing the world. Just because there are lots of people employed, the question is, what type of employment do they have? Are they full-time employees and are they in fields that they are interested in, or are they sort of taking part-time jobs because it's better than nothing? And that's sort of a deeper conversation than you sometimes get with just the number. For those who are unemployed, there are three different types of unemployment that you could fall into. There are frictional, structural, and cyclical unemployment. Frictional unemployment tends to be short-term in nature. It's usually when people are searching for a job. They're going to leave this one job. They expect to get a new job in a couple of weeks, or maybe they've just graduated from college and they're in the job search mode and they expect to find something in the next couple of months. Okay. There's always people looking for jobs, and there's always someone who's dissatisfied in one job and they've quit their one job and they're looking for something else. And because of that, there's always going to be someone who is unemployed, which means the unemployment rate will always be greater than zero. In fact, that's a good thing. You don't want unemployment to be equal to zero because that would mean that no one could ever leave their job ever. And that's not a good thing. When you get fed up and you want to quit, you come in, you fall into the unemployment realm as you look for a new job. Structural unemployment happens when workers have a skill set that is no longer demanded by the market. There's a change in the demand for the goods that they're making, or technology has changed in some way. And so therefore, the workers who had these skills are no longer valued. So workers who know how to fix and repair typewriters are no longer valued in our economy and therefore are structurally unemployed. Or people who know how to make VCRs are structurally unemployed because no one uses one anymore. And so anytime your skills no longer match the current structure of the economy, you are structurally unemployed. And I should say, there are always people who are structurally unemployed because the economy is constantly changing and evolving with new technologies emerging. And again, that's a positive thing. You don't want technology to stagnate because then there's no growth and progress. Right? So there's always going to be structural unemployment as well. Cyclical unemployment is the result of a downturn in the business cycle. All right, when there's a recession and the economy shrinks, there's no longer as much demand for employment. There's no longer as much demand for employees, and so therefore employment rises. And then when the economy expands, there's a need for more workers, and unemployment drops. And so this is sort of a natural cycle within the economy. If we're talking about different types of employment, sort of getting your sense on this, we could say, well, okay, you finished your college degree. You've applied for several jobs, you're waiting to hear back. This is one of the examples of frictional unemployment. Short-term basis, you're going to quickly move into a job, presumably with that new bachelor's degree. If you're a bank teller, and now suddenly people are using ATMs, then the loss of your job is going to create what's known as structural unemployment because we no longer need you in your skills as a bank teller. You might be great at working with customers and counting out bills, but frankly, the machine's quicker and we just don't need you anymore. That's structural unemployment. Or you work for a clothing manufacturer with extra inventory. And so there's lots of extra product out there, and so they don't need you right now to make more. In which case, they're going to fire you for now, lay you off. But it's not that they don't need your skills. People still need clothing to be made. It's just that they don't need clothing to be made right now, which means that you are in a cyclical unemployment situation. As soon as the economy kicks in and people buy up all these new clothes that you've made that have been sitting in inventory, then they'll need you back and they'll hire you happily, and they still need your skills. So it's not a permanent thing. You're not structurally unemployed. It's going to be longer than a few weeks potentially, so you're not frictionally unemployed. So we call this cyclical unemployment. The last thing is this. As I said before, there's always going to be unemployment. It will always be greater than 0% because there will always be people who are shifting jobs. There will always be people who are losing their jobs because of changes in technology. These are what we call natural forms of unemployment. To not have them would be bad. To not have technological change, to not have people be able to leave their jobs, these are all bad. So we're always going to have unemployment rates greater than zero. We call the natural rate of unemployment the unemployment rate that is attributed to the frictional unemployment and structural unemployment. Any deviation from that number is caused by cyclical unemployment. It's caused by changes in the economy's growth or shrinking. And so any deviation is from natural rate is attributed to the cyclical unemployment rate. We'll talk more about unemployment, give you some more examples in class and work through problem sets, and I will see you then.